With the Versus games being an intercompany crossover series, it's natural that sometimes legal stuff just gets in the way of things. Take Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, where one character had to be removed from Ultimate All-Stars because the international rights to use them were being held hostage by a Euro-based license holder. Or Capcom vs. SNK 2, where the development team wanted to use Alien vs. Predator arcade protagonist Lin Kurosawa, but were forced to go with Maki from Final Fight instead, because Lin herself was owned by Fox at the time. Marvel vs. Capcom has probably the most infamous example of this within Capcom's crossover fighters though. Iron Man, who'd appeared in 1995's Marvel Superheroes, found himself locked up in video game exclusivity rights held by Acclaim, who'd used said license to develop Iron Man and XO Man-O-War and Heavy Metal, a crossover action game between the two Marvel and Valiant heroes. Because of this, Iron Man was absent from Capcom fighting games until Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in 2000, presumably because Acclaim's contract ended by that point. But Capcom definitely wanted Iron Man's gameplay, his functions if you will, to be represented even if they couldn't use the man himself. So instead, Capcom pulled one of the funniest, yet legitimately most clever examples of license sidestepping I've ever seen. They took Iron Man's sprites, recolored him, made some minor additions, gave him an additional hyper combo and new voice lines, and inserted him into Marvel 1's roster not as Iron Man, but his partner, War Machine. The War Machine armor is piloted by James Rhodes, commonly nicknamed Rhodey, a pilot for the US Marines and one of Tony Stark's oldest friends. Rhodes grew up in Philadelphia and was the target of both racial abuse from kids as well as gang members that disliked him because they took his commitment to his studies as James thinking he's better than them. After joining the Marines, he'd find himself knee-deep in the Vietnam conflict as a pilot and get shot down. While trying to repair his craft, he meets Tony Stark, who was in the middle of his escape from the region in his very first Iron Man suit. The two become friends after Rhodey jumpstarts Tony's armor using his aircraft. Tony later offers him a job as his personal pilot, and after initially declining, Rhodey takes him up on his offer. When Tony's alcoholism starts to impact his ability to function as Iron Man, Rhodey calls an audible and puts on the Iron Man armor to stop an imminent threat, since Tony's too blasted to be of use at the moment. After he saves the day, he attempts to return the armor, but Tony gives Rhodey his blessing to continue as Iron Man in his stead. This continued for a bit, but he'd start experiencing severe headaches after donning the armor, a consequence of the suit's cybernetics being coded for Tony's brain patterns, not his. This in turn began to give him delusions of Tony secretly wanting to take back the armor from him. After figuring out the source of his headaches and becoming more at peace with himself, James and Tony, temporarily donning his first armor, go up against the machinations of Obadiah Stane, who incites an incident that severely injures Rhodey. Tony, donning a new suit of armor he was originally intending to give Rhodey, instead dons the armor and fights Stane instead. Not long after this, Tony presumably dies and leaves behind his newest set of armor for Rhodey, wanting him to use it while also taking control of the company he had just established, Stark Enterprises. This customized armor marked the first appearance of the War Machine suit, though the armor itself is technically considered Mark 11 of the Iron Man armor, first appearing in issue 281 of Iron Man. The War Machine armor looks similar to Tony's various armors, but is generally a lot bulkier. That bulk isn't for show, however. War Machine armors generally have way more artillery packed into them than Tony's armors do. Generally speaking, you use Tony's suits if you want efficiency and style, and you use Rhodey's if you want to blow several holes into something. According to War Machine co-creator Len Kaminsky, one of the biggest inspirations for War Machine's armor design was, funnily enough, the cover for the Incredible Hulk issue 390. As it turned out, Tony faked his death, and Rhodey, upon finding out that Tony kept even him out of the loop, severs their friendship and strikes out on his own. Stark and Rhodey would later mend their friendship and work closely together, with Tony upgrading James' armor whenever necessary, and James sticking by him during some of Tony's lowest points, like Civil War and the fallout from that. Rhodey would also find himself on some superhero teams occasionally, most notably the West Coast Avengers, which he joined immediately after walking out on Tony. Speaking of Civil War, one of the inciting events of the second superhero Civil War was the death of Rhodey at the hands of Thanos, who literally blew his back out. The war ended with Captain Marvel more or less killing Iron Man, but Tony's body managed to reboot itself thanks to the years of genetic modification Tony had endured to be able to pilot his suit. He realizes the same could theoretically be done to resurrect Rhodey and immediately seeks out his body to do so, which he does successfully. As a kid growing up in the 90s, I had a handful of comics with War Machine in them, but I think outside of Marvel vs. Capcom, my biggest exposure to him was probably his presence in Marvel's 1990s animated cartoon continuity, guest starring in Spider-Man the Animated Series, and being a regular character in Iron Man the Animated Series, voiced both by Dorian Harewood and the legendary James Avery. In Marvel vs. Capcom itself, he's voiced by neither man, instead being voiced by Wayne Ward. He's still in the acting field today, having small roles in The Boys, Shazam, and a whole bunch of other shows and movies. Despite only appearing in 2 games, there's a lot we've got to get into with this guy. So, without further ado, alright, before we get into his moveset, I'm gonna get on a soapbox for a bit because I want to talk about something that's been kind of a weird, nitpicky sticking point for me over the years: War Machine's theme. I see it often stated that War Machine's theme in Marvel vs. Capcom 1 is a remix of Iron Man's theme in Marvel Superheroes, and while that would actually be pretty neat, that's only kind of the case here. War Machine's theme is, for the most part, entirely original. The melody is completely unique, it's a lot higher tempo, and it has different lead instruments. But there is actually a piece of connective tissue to Iron Man's Marvel Superheroes theme in the composition, and I think this is what trips people up. Iron Man's stage theme in Marvel Superheroes begins with a 6-note melody that repeats throughout the song's duration. Take a listen. Here, I'll even isolate it so you know what to listen for. Now, listen closely to the intro portion and bridge sections of War Machine's theme. Hear it now? War Machine's theme tips its hat to Iron Man's old theme by incorporating that 6-note melody at the beginning and the end of the track before it loops, but is largely an original theme overall. And that's actually really fitting for War Machine. He started as a replacement Iron Man, but went on to become his own man and his own hero, and the fact that the music reflects that is honestly really cool. It's something Capcom composers have done when they want to reference, but not outright remix a theme. Sodam's Exism Alpha 3 theme mixes in the melody of his Final Fight boss theme. And speaking of Alpha 3, Kaden's Street Fighter V theme is an original composition, but the melody of her Alpha 3 theme is mixed into the bridge of that track as well. I should also mention the theme's composer, someone I haven't gotten to talk about in this series yet, Masato Kouda. He joined Capcom in the mid-90s and worked closely with Darkstalkers series composer Takayuki Iwai, having worked together on Cyberbots and Vampire Savior, before replacing Yuki Iwai as Yuko Takahara's collaborator for Marvel vs. Capcom 1. He was responsible for the arrangements of Spider-Man, Hulk, Chun-Li, and Gambit's themes, as well as Venom, Morrigan, and Jin's themes. He's also notably the person that composed the character select theme for the game, a song that in my opinion is probably the best character select theme in the genre, rivaled only by Soul Calibur 2's. When I think of Marvel vs. Capcom, there's generally two themes that come to mind. The first is Captain America's Marvel 1 theme for reasons I've gone into in this character video, and the other is this one. Marvel vs. Capcom 1 has the most electric, high-energy atmosphere of all of the Versus games, and this character select screen is a big reason why. It's larger than life in the same way the game itself is. Kouda would later go on to work on some of the Devil May Cry 1 and 2 soundtrack before becoming a frequent contributor to the early Monster Hunter games up until the late 2000s or so, his most well-known piece being Tigrex's theme in Monster Hunter Freedom 2. He'd leave Capcom soon after to start his own music studio, Design Wave, and has worked on games ranging from Smash Bros., where he did the Light Plane remixes for the Pilot Wing stage, and even collabed with his former employers Capcom a few times, contributing to the Mega Man Tenor Range albums, and working on the Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection soundtrack with fellow ex-Capcom alumni Kenzo Hasegawa. War Machine is flat out one of the most dangerous characters on the roster. He's not without his cons, but there's way more pros than cons to talk about here. He's the only character in the game with a flight mode, which gives him fantastic mobility off the bat. He has fantastic air-to-air normals that can lead into air combos and potentially touches of death. He builds meter incredibly fast. He makes up half of the game's most infamous team, more on that later, and he has some pretty decent zoning overall. For as good in the air as he is though, his ground game isn't that great. And honestly, he's a pretty high execution character. Some of his most difficult combos are a must to get the most out of him without struggling. War Machine has some important command normals to touch on. They're arguably more important to his game plan than some of his special moves. It goes without saying that pretty much all but one of his moves are lifted from Iron Man's Marvel Superheroes moveset. First is Knee Dive, done with down and medium kick. This one's main utility is its ability to be cancelled into his heavy normals and most importantly his flight state. I don't know if I'd call it his party starter, but considering aerial normals are how you want to get combos started with War Machine, you'll want to fish for them with this if possible. Focus Shot is done by pressing heavy punch and either up or down to angle it. The upwards version is arguably War Machine's most important button, since it's his primary air-to-air tool and that's how you'll be ideally getting his flight combo started. Upwards kick is done with up and heavy kick in the air. The animation for this attack is pretty similar to his ground launcher. His first special move is Shoulder Cannon, done with a quarter circle forward and any attack button.
Shoulder cannon! Ah!
Great!
The attack button you chose determines the attack's height. The punch version fires at normal height, and the kick version fires low. Only the punch variation can be used in the air. Visually, this move is interesting because while it more or less functions like Tony's Unibeam special in other games, it's actually been reanimated to launch from his shoulder cannon instead. While War Machine does typically have access to a Unibeam in the comics, he's far better known for his shoulder-mounted cannon, though they typically provide machine gun and artillery fire. He has occasionally used it for energy projection though. Smart Bomb is done with medium punch and light kick.
Attack!
Smart bomb! Smart bomb!
While the move itself is largely the same as Marvel Superheroes, the input's been changed from two kicks to an asymmetrical punch and kick button input, kinda like how Wolverine's Drill Claw did. This, as always, can be done in the air. Repulsor Blast is done with a half circle back and punch.
Repulsor!
Attack!
Repulsor! Ah!
This is the same as Iron Man's in other games, and his dedicated anti-air. War Machine can initiate flight freely with a quarter circle back and two kicks. War Machine is very specifically the only character with a flight mode in Marvel 1, and it's no surprise it's one of the reasons he's one of the best characters in the game. War Machine's first hyper combo is a recognizable one, Proton Cannon.
Marvelous!
Here's my Sunday best! Proton cannon!
Marvelous!
This functions pretty much identically to Iron Man's in previous games, horrific startup and sneaky startup hitbox and all. We'll get into the origin of the proton cannon in Tony's eventual video. Rhodey's line for this super is another one of the all-time great Marvel vs. Capcom lines in my opinion.
Here's my Sunday best. Proton cannon.
Marvelous!
War Machine actually gets an entirely new super here, War Destroyer, done with the quarter circle forward in 2 kicks.
Geronimo! War Destroyer!
Wonderful!
War Machine fires a bunch of missiles upwards, which rains back down on the opponent. Because of how the move is oriented, the best way to combo into it is with his launcher, which it thankfully combos pretty cleanly out of. It does more damage than Proton Cannon if every missile happens to connect as well. Here are War Machine's colors in the arcade version, and here are his extra colors in the PS1 port. And here's his ending. Overall, War Machine does his job as an Iron Man stand-in pretty well in Marvel 1. His overall utility and his damage output, especially with flight combos, is worth its weight in gold. Speaking of...
Go! Yahoo! Geronimo!
Gold War Machine is an unlockable variant of War Machine in Marvel vs. Capcom 1. As you can see, his entire sprite is gold, and his speed and weight matches this. Gold War Machine can be fought in arcade mode by using none of your partner characters in every match, getting 3 variable combo finishes and 3 variable cross finishes as well, all before stage 7. In most versions of the game, he can be selected by inputting this code at the character select screen. In the Dreamcast version, you have to fulfill the requirements to fight him, then finish arcade mode in order to save him as a permanently unlocked character to the VMU. In the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, you can either use the code, or permanently enable all secret characters from the start via the EX options menu. Marvel 1's top 3 characters are generally considered to be Red Venom, War Machine, and the Gold War Machine, and as we'll soon see, Gold War Machine pretty easily earns that claim. He's unbothered, in his lane, moisturized. Gold War Machine has permanent hyper armor, meaning any moves with capture stage just don't work on him, and he walks through most attacks, similarly to Zangief's Iron Body. He's also the other half of Marvel 1's most infamous team setup. On that note, Dual War Destroyer during variable cross is one of the single most damaging offensive maneuvers in the game, even with just chip damage. He also hits way harder than War Machine does. That said, he's incredibly slow and his mobility is dog shit. He can't block, and he's a somewhat controversial team pick, being seen as dishonorable by some players. While Gold War Machine is original to Marvel 1, it does call to mind the Mark III variant of the first Iron Man suit, which was also big, bulky, and colored all gold as well. There's a bit of lore behind Gold War Machine and some of the other secret characters in this game, but it's only evident in the Japanese version. We'll talk about that in a later video in further detail though. As I mentioned earlier, Gold War Machine is slow. He's the heaviest character in the game, even more so than Hulk. The screen even shakes every time he walks. His moveset is mostly the same as War Machine's, but there are a few key differences with some moves, and at least one omission. Knee Dive is performed the same way, but because of his weight, he rockets down to the ground comically fast. Because you want to be on the ground pretty much always with Gold War Machine, you probably won't be using this move much. Focus Shot is more or less unchanged as well. Same with Upwards Kick. Shoulder Cannon is the first notable change.
Shoulder cannon! Shoulder cannon!
War Machine fires a single missile from his shoulder cannon instead of a beam, the button strength determining how fast it travels across the screen. So what's happened to the beam attack? Well, it's now his crouching heavy punch. It's not full screen like regular War Machine shoulder cannon is. You have to get in close for it to hit multiple times. Smart Bomb is largely the same as his normal variation.
Smart bomb. Smart bomb.
Proton Cannon is the other big moveset change.
Marvelous!
Here's my Sunday best. Proton cannon.
It still has the hitbox on activation and the really slow startup, but instead of a large beam, he shoots out a stream of missiles instead. While it might not look as cool depending on who you ask, this actually does way more damage than the original version, both on hit and on block. War Destroyer is essentially the same as well.
War destroyer.
Wonderful!
Geronimo. War destroyer.
War Destroyer in particular shines when paired up with another War Machine during a variable cross, since combined, they do an obscene amount of chip damage, let alone regular damage. Here are Gold War Machine's colors in the arcade version. And here's his exclusive extra colors in the PS1 port. Gold War Machine has the generic secret character ending, but here it is anyway.
Defect bank.
Alright, comic book time. War Machine's comic book trajectory is pretty spotty. Not necessarily quality-wise, but more so because he's generally used as an Iron Man supporting character, and the times he struck out on his own have been pretty sporadic. First off, let's talk about some important stories regardless of which book he was featured in. Probably the most important starting point for tracing Rhodey's path to War Machine is issues 169 and 170 of The Invincible Iron Man. This features Tony at one of his lowest points, having let his alcoholism consume him. This happens while he finds himself in conflict with the villain Magma. Magma takes the fight to Tony's doorstep, but is pretty clearly wasted and not in any condition to be standing up, let alone performing heroics. Rhodey, realizing the direness of the situation, reluctantly dons the armor to fight Magma off. Rhodey dons the armor for the next 30 issues or so, going through some of the issues I mentioned earlier in the video, like the headaches and the eventual injury in issue 199 that forces Tony to take up the armor again. It also bears mentioning that when the original 1984 Secret Wars crossover happened, Rhodey was the active Iron Man at the time, so he's the one that got pulled into Battle World. Issue 281 of Iron Man features the War Machine armor's debut, though it's worn by a seriously ill Tony at first to fend off some attackers. Issue 284 features the quote-unquote death of Tony, who leaves behind the War Machine armor for Rhodey, as well as his entire company. This was all a gambit by Tony though, and in issues 289 through 291, Rhodey gets fed up with Tony's manipulations and leaves, taking the armor with him. Rhodey ends up joining the West Coast Avengers starting at issue 94 of that book. In the mid-90s, he'd even get his own self-titled solo series. Believing he's doing the right thing to save an important diplomatic official, he goes guns blazing into a situation and accidentally kickstarts an international incident, drawing him the ire of other countries, S.H.I.E.L.D., and even Tony himself. Soon after, the armor starts running into issues, and he confronts Tony, who he's still at odds with, to get the weapon schematics from him, by fair means or by force. And it eventually devolves into force. At least before Mandarin shows up and sucks the two of them into a crossover event. Comic books, y'all. Rhodey builds up something resembling a small supporting cast in this book, but the most bizarre thing about this book by far is the weird alien armor he acquires in the last half dozen or so issues of the run. After this, Rhodey is mostly a supporting character in Iron Man stories. He'll pop up occasionally, may even don one of Tony's suits specifically if the situation calls for it, or even join a team book for a short time, the most prominent example being Ed Brubaker's Secret Avengers, alongside characters like Beast, Nova, Moon Knight, and Valkyrie. There is one more run I'd like to bring up though. Dark Reign was a status quo in Marvel where Norman Osborn became director of S.H.I.E.L.D. That's a long story, we'll probably talk about it someday. But what's important is that this pretty much took Tony, the previous director, off the board. Norman establishes a new Avengers team, though in reality, it's more or less the Thunderbolts acting as heroes. Venom is Spider-Man, Bullseye is Hawkeye, Norman taking up the identity of Iron Patriot, and so on. One character that joined of their own volition though was Ares, the Greek god of war. This will be important in a sec. During this time, War Machine found himself in a new solo book, and he's, well, not quite the War Machine we're used to for reasons that will become evident in a sec. It's a short 12-issue run written by a writer best known for Hulk stories like Planet Hulk and World War Hulk, but it's a pretty interesting run all the same and worth talking about. This video's comic book recommendation is Greg Pak's 2009 War Machine series. This book starts off in Santa Marco, a country torn by war, where the president executes citizens with the Sentinel while other countries turn a blind eye because helping doesn't further their interests. That is, until War Machine arrives on the scene and kills the tyrants responsible for said executions. Someone gets a good shot on him with a rocket, and his arms completely blow off his body. Don't worry though, because as the following flashback shows, Rhodey was gravely injured in combat a year earlier, and Tony, man with the plan that he is, outfits him with the latest in cybernetic implants until they can find a more permanent, more human looking and feeling body solution for him. Almost like some kind of cyborg. Terrible jokes aside, this new cyborg body is uniquely made without Stark tech, making it nigh untraceable. It's meant to be a stopgap for a replacement body that was being developed for him. But the facility developing it is attacked by Norman Osborn, who has interest in this replacement body. Rhodey's kind of overacting under peaceful pretenses in this run, and realizes action is the only way things are ever going to get done. So there's a lot of action in this run. One interesting wrinkle with Rhodey's new body is his ability to interface and integrate other technology into his suit on the fly. This ranges from taking enemy missiles and making them his own, or the time he became Blitztank. It makes more sense in context, I swear. With Osborn working against him though, he eventually decides to send one of his Dark Avengers against him, and who better to send against the War Machine than the literal god of war himself. Things eventually escalate and Norman himself gets personally involved, leading to an eventual War Machine vs Iron Patriot showdown. For a 12-issue book, it moves really fast, but it's one of the more creative War Machine stories out there. Fair warning though, this book isn't gory like say a Marvel Max imprint book, but there's definitely a handful of pages that may be uncomfortable for the squeamish. It's probably not a spoiler to say, yeah, he gets a new body, but it's the how that makes this story interesting, and I think the conclusion and the way we get there is pretty satisfying. War Machine returns in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and he gets some small but noticeable tweaks that ultimately affects how he's played. War Machine finally gets to team up with his boy Tony in Marvel 2, but is there any reason to use him over his more well-known counterpart? He is capable of doing Iron Man's Infinite, so he's already off to a good start there. His mobility is still pretty good. He still has 8-way air dashes in flight. And he still has War Destroyer, which is still his best super. He is slightly heavier this time around though. This actually affects his jumps and the difficulty of his infinites. Specifically, he has to do the inputs for them slightly faster than Iron Man would. Proton Cannon is still pretty slow, and it's even more pronounced in Marvel 2. Since it's a more volatile game, he's more liable to get sniped. And honestly, his frame data overall isn't as good as Iron Man's. To expand on that last point, with Iron Man being mostly ripped from Marvel superheroes, same hitboxes, frame data and all, he can get away with a bit more, since his Marvel superheroes frame data in particular was pretty generous. When War Machine was added to Marvel 1, much of that frame data was toned down to bring him in line with the rest of the cast, and that carries over to Marvel 2, whereas they did no such thing to Iron Man. He received some interesting changes on top of that too though, bringing him closer to Gold War Machine in certain aspects. With medium buttons being removed, his knee dive has moved to down and heavy kick, as opposed to down and medium kick in the previous game. His shoulder cannon is the biggest change, now instead acting similarly to Gold War Machine's in that it fires a missile instead of a beam, though he does fire multiple as opposed to the single one Gold War Machine can shoot at a time.
Shoulder cannon. Shoulder cannon. Yeah.
Like Gold War Machine in that game, this also means that his shoulder beam is now down in heavy punch. Proton Cannon still has the same motion, but now also functions like Gold War Machine's.
Here's my Sunday best.
Because of the way Marvel 2's projectile hit stun tends to operate with multi-hit moves though, opponents are far more prone to falling out of the attack than in Marvel 1, which is annoying. It does a lot of damage if every missile connects though, but it has to be very specifically set up to do so. And because the special was still slow as molasses, the only way you'll be landing this is via DHCs and Team Hyper combos. As mentioned before, War Machine is capable of Iron Man's infinites, he just has to work a little harder for them since his slightly heavier weight means that you have to time the inputs slightly faster. His first assist is Shoulder Cannon. His second assist is Repulsor Blast. His third assist is Smart Bomb. Here are his colors. His last color takes on the metallic white and dark gray color scheme of the armor from when it first debuted in the comics. I know some of y'all are probably thinking, why not fold this into a dual Iron Man and War Machine video? And that's a valid question. On top of those multi-character videos being a pretty laborious endeavor, especially as I'm also in production of another one currently, I wanted to give War Machine his own spotlight. So much of his existence is tied to being in the shadow of Iron Man in pretty much all media. Marvel vs. Capcom, or at least the first one, is one of the few times he's gotten a chance to shine for himself, and I felt like I'd be selling the character short by making him share a video with Iron Man. That said, being so closely tied to Tony means that he's a character that's benefited from Iron Man's astronomical boost in popularity from the late 2000s onwards, being portrayed in the first Iron Man movie by Terrence Howard, then a completely different main in Don Cheadle for the rest of the Marvel movies to the current day. In video games specifically, the War Machine armor almost always ends up being an alternate skin for Tony, like in the Avengers game or the Ultimate Alliance series, but sometimes he'll be playable as his own character, like in the LEGO Marvel games. The Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite Beyond mod, which as of this video's script writing is still upcoming, also adds a War Machine color for Iron Man as well. I always thought it was weird that Marvel 3 nor Infinite referenced him at all outside of a cameo in Hawkeye's ending. Bro couldn't even get a Heroes and Heralds card. That said, that's going to do it for this video. As always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.